They have started a few weeks ago, and we've tried to conduct more sessions and analysis about the issue. So we're glad to today host distinguished guests, Mr. Walter Posch and Riccardo Alcaro. Riccardo is a research coordinator and head of Global Actors Program at IAI, Istituto Affari Internazionali, and he has worked extensively in the fields of transatlantic relations, especially with regards to Europe's surrounding regions. He has also been a visiting fellow at Brookings Institute. And he's also the author of Europe and Iran's Nuclear Crisis, one of the prominent books with regards to the nuclear deal. So I would introduce Walter Posch after your presentation, of course, but I would like to welcome everyone, all the guests that are present at the moment. Okay, over to you, Riccardo.
Fatemeh, thank you so much. You tell me if you don't hear me well. I'm assuming you do now hear me well. So thanks to the Institute, Eurica Institute, for inviting me over to speak about this topic, the Iranian nuclear issue from a European perspective, which indeed has occupied my has kept me occupied, has kept me busy for, I don't even know how long anymore, for many, many, many years. I think I started following this issue back in 2004. I would not have ever imagined, I would never imagine that almost over 15 years later, we would still be where we were so many years ago, with this nuclear issue still unresolved. I would also like to thank you personally, Fatemeh, for reaching out to me and for inviting me to speak here. And it's great to have the possibility to speak alongside such an expert in Iranian related stuff as Walter Posch. He's really one of the go-to people in Europe when it comes to really learn how things stand in the Middle East. I can tell you it's not that easy, especially if you work in a think tank. Perhaps in academia is a bit different. So Fatemeh, you asked me to speak about the Europe's view and more broadly the Western views of the Iranian nuclear issue. I will start with Europe, and then perhaps during the discussion we will be able to broaden out the topic to the United States and other countries as well. So let me start from the very basic stuff we should all be aware of when it comes to Europe and the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or Iran nuclear deal. Or better, when it comes to Europe and Iran's nuclear program. So why is Europe involved? What has Europe at stake in the whole nuclear issue surrounding the Iranian nuclear program? Well, there are three sets of problems or three sets of interests / concerns. So first, non-proliferation concerns. Europe is Europe, and by Europe here I mean the main European Union member states, as well as the United Kingdom, which was a member up until a couple of years ago. So for the most part of the Iranian nuclear crisis, the UK acted also as a member of the EU, and the EU as such, as an organization. So Europe does have genuine proliferation concerns, and these are of two orders, although very much related. The first is that Iran might indeed get to the point when it really believes it is in its interest to abandon the non-proliferation treaty to which it is a party and build up a nuclear arsenal. There is, I mean, the overall assessment in Europe is that Iran has never actually taken such a decision, but the overwhelming consensus is probably that Iran wants to have an industrial nuclear capacity, which, if circumstances were to really deteriorate for Iran, could lead it to build a nuclear arsenal, a nuclear deterrent in as short a time as possible. So, so this is the first non-proliferation concern. The second, which is more urgent, is that other countries in the region, especially countries that haven't good relations with Iran, Saudi Arabia, but even Turkey or Egypt. So with countries with which Iran has had a complex, at times troubled, at times rivalrous relationship, might be tempted to emulate Iran and build up their own nuclear capacity. And if Iran were to go nuclear, they could go nuclear too. So this is the non-proliferation issue. But the real point is that the Europeans want the non-proliferation treaty and its verification system to work. And Iran is really a test case for that. The second issue, which is probably, which has grown in importance, because I think the proliferation concern was higher in the beginning, so like 15 years ago or 10 years ago. Now is coming back. But the real point here, I mean, the other issue of concerns for the Europeans is that the development by Iran of a nuclear program, even if it is only a civilian one, because of the Janus-like nature of nuclear technology, which means that a civilian nuclear program can be turned to nuclear purposes with relative ease. So the point is that Iran developing this capacity might create such tensions with other countries, most notably Israel, that Israel itself, or Israel plus the United States, might actually get to the point where they believe that they can only stop Iran's nuclear advancement, or at least slow it down significantly, by way of a military strike, a bombing campaign against Iran's nuclear facilities, Iran's defenses, probably other Iran's military targets. And this might very much trigger a chain reaction, an escalatory process that would lead Iran to activate its allies across the region against Western allied targets. And again, so the issue would be further insecurity, further instability. In the worst case scenario, even a generalized, regionalized conflict. So these two issues, these two concerns, non-proliferation concerns and regional security concerns, are the main drivers behind Europe's involvement in the Iranian nuclear issue. There is a third one, which is not so much a concern as an interest, which was stronger, bigger, probably some years ago, but it hasn't gone away. And that's the economic, trade and energy interest. Iran is a big energy producer, potentially is a massive energy producer and exporter. Europe is always searching for differentiating its sources of energy imports. Iran is also a relatively big market with a lot of potential for becoming an even bigger, wealthier market. So a market of destination of European exports, in particular Italian exports or German exports, French exports. So there is actually a lot of unexploited economic potential in the relationship with Iran. So I am pretty sure that this featured much higher in the beginning of this whole process in the European agenda. Now there isn't much of a hope of normalizing entirely the EU-Iran economic relationship as there was perhaps in 2015 when the nuclear deal was struck, but still perhaps not so much for investments right now, but Iran is still important for European exporters. So these are the three main interests. What has Europe done in order to defend and pursue these interests? Well, before 2015, the Europeans were pretty essential, although their role isn't recognized as it should, especially in the United States. But they were really essential in creating the conditions for, first, the United States leave their non-policy towards Iran in 2003, 2004, when the whole nuclear issue really emerged in full to its full extent. The Bush administration, the administration of President George W. Bush, really did not have any options, any viable options to deal with the issue. The Europeans, with the engagement of Iran, which is very old, it started in the late summer of 2003 on the Iranian issue, gradually brought the United States, gradually and ambivalently, but still brought the United States to abandon the policy of non-contact with Iran on the nuclear issue, and eventually the United States joined the Europeans alongside Russia and China in the P5+1, or as we should call it more properly, the E3/EU+3 group. So the Europeans were really essential in creating the conditions for all this to happen. I won't go any further into that, but I think they deserve a lot of credit for what they did before 2015, in the sense that they really they did not just talk the talk, but walk the walk when it came to doing something about pursuing their interests in the Iranian nuclear issue. Post 2018, so post the 8th of May of 2018, the date in which President Trump, former US President Trump, decided to unilaterally, and I would say illegitimately or illegally violated or abandoned the JCPOA, violated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which had been, of course, struck in July 2015 under the Obama administration. The Europeans' record is not as good. I know the Iranians are extremely frustrated with what they perceive as European weakness and European ambiguity, also concerning their inability to safeguard their trade with Iran. I would not go the extra mile to defend the Europeans. I believe they could have done more, especially at the rhetorical level. But when I have this conversation with my Iranian friends and colleagues and partners, I always try to remind them that first, it is not just the Europeans who were incapable of overcoming the extraterritorial reach of the US secondary sanctions. The Russians weren't able to do that. The Chinese weren't able to do that. And the reason why the Chinese continue to trade with Iran more, specifically buying its oil, is very much related to the structure of the economy of China and to the fact that China is certainly not strategically aligned with the United States as the Europeans are. So my point being that the Europeans have to take account of many factors when it comes to dealing with Iran, and for them it is not easy to go explicitly and publicly against what the US policy is. And under Trump, the US policy was maximum pressure, and the Europeans never joined maximum pressure. They always were against it. But yes, I totally granted they were incapable of doing anything more than talk, but still they talk. I mean, it was the Europeans who denounced maximum pressure more than the Russians and the Chinese did, or as much as the Russians and the Chinese did. It was the Europeans who defended the JCPOA from the last attack the Trump administration waged against it in the summer of 2020, when the Trump administration tried to block the expiration of an embargo on arms sales to Iran, which, according to the UN Security Council Resolution 2231, which is the resolution which incorporates the JCPOA, was set to expire in October 2020. And the calculus by the Trump administration was that if they managed to block the expiration of the arms embargo, Iran would leave the JCPOA formally, as it hadn't done at the time, because that would have been seen in Tehran, and rightly so, as a further violation of the JCPOA. And the Europeans blocked that, and in that they were pretty successful. And let's not forget that it is in the ears of the Trump administration's sanctions on Iran, which are also sanctions against European companies because they have extraterritorial reach. It was during these years that the Europeans started to publicly speak of the need to create mechanisms to defend their banks and their companies. And while the INSTEX trade facility mechanism they set up to do legitimate trade with Iran did not work, you have to understand, this is again what I say to my Iranian colleagues and friends, that it was extremely difficult for the Europeans to come out with a working mechanism, because in order to avoid the reach of the US regulators, something structural has to change in the way the European companies and banks are integrated into financial markets. And something structural means something that has to happen over the years. But just last week, the European Commission presented plans which it calls anti-coercion mechanisms, which basically are a number of ideas by which, according to which the European Union can better protect itself from external pressure, including extraterritorial sanctions imposed by third countries, even if they're allies like the United States. Finally, what happened in early 2021, this year, when the Trump administration left office and the Biden administration and Biden went to the White House, well, the Europeans made an initial push for the Biden administration to follow through immediately on Biden's promise during the campaign that he would rejoin the nuclear deal. They wanted the Biden administration to send immediate, and they realized that that wasn't possible because of a number of reasons, most notably that Biden really needed to have his Iran and foreign policy and security policy team in place. So a lot of people criticized the Biden administration because it was it took it up until April to restart negotiations or to reinvest in nuclear diplomacy with Iran. I would say that that's an unfair criticism. Whoever knows how the U.S. Presidential system works knows that starting a major foreign policy initiative in about 3 months is not that bad. It's actually pretty good, precisely because you did not have the people to staff your offices and teams which are supposed to do the diplomacy. The problem was that the timing wasn't perfect, in the sense that but the Biden administration came into office when the Rouhani administration, which was very much committed to the JCPOA, was about to leave office. Still, they went pretty far in terms of finding an agreement on how to rejoin, on how the US would rejoin the JCPOA and Iran would return in full compliance with that. Then the Iranian presidential election happened, and it took the Raisi administration 5 months to feel ready, as the Biden administration needed 3 months. So it took over 5 months for the Raisi administration to feel ready to go back to the negotiations. Here we are. the negotiations are apparently not going very well, or at least this is what you gauge from the outside. Clearly, they were not as the negotiations now are harder than they were in the early part of 2021. I will not go into the detail of the negotiations now, because I think this is something that Walter can address and we can surely address during the Q&A. I will only say that, as usual, the Europeans are extremely frustrating from the point of view of the Iranians, because they express an intention for doing something which the United States is not doing at the moment, but fail all the time to press the United States to make a public argument for the United States to do more than it actually does. Look, I share most of these frustrations, but I have to, I have also to remind you of one thing. For the Europeans, pursuing those interests I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention, so non-proliferation, regional security, and the pursuit of a more normal, more stable economic relationship, even political dialogue with Iran. All this, for the Europeans, can only be achieved if there is a nuclear deal. And the nuclear deal for the Europeans can only happen if the United States buys into it. And this is why the Europeans were so frustratingly slow to make concessions to the Iranians in the early 2000s. This is why the Europeans were willing to impose sanctions on Iran from especially 2010 on. This is also why the Europeans, when the nuclear deal was struck but wasn't still operational, went to Washington to speak with members of Congress in order to persuade them to not to block the deal, which was a real possibility in the summer of 2015, the late summer of 2015. But the Europeans did so behind closed doors, and this is why the Europeans never went head-to-head against the Trump administration's policy. They just said, this policy for us is not working. We want to keep the JCPOA alive, but you never hear that kind of denunciation, that kind of anytime Iran exceeded one of its limits under the JCPOA, the Europeans came out with a public statement condemning Iran. They didn't do that with regard to the United States, even though it was the United States that had made the massive violation of leaving the JCPOA. I can only imagine how frustrating this should be for the Iranians. But the point is, for the Europeans see the only possibility of serving their interests with Iran as being enabled by US-Iranian nuclear diplomacy. So the Europeans believe that they can only serve their interests in full if they facilitate US-Iranian nuclear diplomacy. And of course, they cannot be fully impartial there, fully balanced, because Iran is not an ally of Europe, whereas the United States is not just an ally, but it's security guarantor. So it is an awkward situation, the one of the Europeans. They never get the credit for what they do, and they always get more criticisms for what they don't do. But still, I can assure you, the Europeans are very much interested in nuclear diplomacy, are very much interested in solving the nuclear issue and seeing whether this might lead to better, more stable regional relations, and also in the long term to significantly improve relations between Europe and Iran itself. And I will stop here.
Thank you, Riccardo. It was a very comprehensive and insightful presentation. So just, of course, you gave quite a structured presentation, and you wrapped it up at the end. But I just, for review, you mentioned that the main three reasons for Europe to keep working on the revival of the deal is the non-proliferation goal, especially not with regard to Iran, not only with regard to Iran, but also in the region as a whole. Also, the regional security issue, the regional security concerns about the possibility of conflict among regional states, specifically Iran and some Arab countries such as Saudi Arabia. And also the last reason, the last but not the least, is the differentiating goal of differentiating sources of energy and investment. I would like to just add one point and just ask a question, a brief question, and then we will move on to Mr. Posch's presentation. You mentioned that at the beginning, the non-proliferation goal was much more important for the Europe and for the US as well, and it was high on the agenda. Of course, the issue of investment in Iran and energy cooperation has become less perhaps vital as the negotiations have progressed. I would like to know what is your personal opinion on this? Do you think that still the main goal is non-proliferation? And how much does the investment issue, the security concern, is still on the agenda? And do you think that the concerns about other regional states developing nuclear programs, is it a serious concern at the moment, or do you think there might be other frameworks that can be contained or handled?
Well, I still think that the three main interests, non-proliferation, regional security, and economic cooperation with Iran, are still there. They still drive Europe's policy towards Iran, or especially towards the Iranian nuclear issue. I think that back in the early 2000s, there was more uncertainty about whether Iran had some hidden facilities, okay, and there was also more uncertainty about Iran's intention. I think that 15 years of continuous engagement with the Iranians, of continuous inspections by the International Atomic Energy Agency in Iran, 15 years of continuous strategic assessments by intelligence services in the United States and the rest of Europe, and the sheer amount of thinking that people have devoted to this issue have resulted in a situation in which the non-proliferation concern is very much alive, but probably now the Europeans fear less. They are more certain that Iran will only go nuclear if things really, really go badly. And I guess that as of now, the overall assessment is that the Iranian leadership has never taken the decision to weaponize its nuclear program. The Europeans, I think they are also more aware that for other countries such as Saudi Arabia or Turkey or Egypt, so countries that might potentially consider the nuclear option, actually going nuclear is not that easy as it might seem. And so there are a number of things that have to materialize before a regional nuclear arms race starts in the region. Clearly, when Iran is advancing its nuclear program to a state where the nuclear program has never been, when Iran is taking steps such as enriching uranium not just to 60%, but perhaps even contemplating enriching it to 90%. So steps that are only compatible with a military dimension of a nuclear program, then you have these proliferation concerns go back to the table. But more pressing is the security, is the regional security issue, because the Europeans, and I guess not just the Europeans, believe that before they would have to be concerned about an Iranian atomic bomb, they would have to concern themselves with a regional conflict, because Israel or the United States and Israel would have intervened to try to stop Iran to advance to that point. Something the Europeans really, really, really don't want to see happen. And I guess the Americans too. So, but I guess no party actually wants a military confrontation. Not sure even the Israelis. You might have heard that in this last weeks, the Israelis, a number of former Israeli officials have come out publicly saying that, you know what, after all, pushing the United States out of the JCPOA wasn't that good of an idea. So they are sort of regretting it. So the problem is, how far can Iran go before the talks break off and the situation takes an escalatory turn? I think there is still time, but I guess that this is something Walter might step in and elaborate on, and I will be happy to do that afterwards, because I have lots of ideas about that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I really think this is your discussion about regional security actually leads into Walter's presentation, and we are all ears. The floor is yours, Mr. Posch.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me at this great meeting. I have to start with the disclaimer. Disclaimer number one is...
Sorry, I just wanted to give a brief introduction about you. Of course, just after your disclaimer.
I only can speak in my private academic capacity. I'm not talking in the name of the Defense College or the General Staff of the Austrian Army. So I'm totally private here.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yes, sure. Thank you. Well, Mr. Walter Posch, of course, is well known in Europe with regards to Iran study, and he has done a lot of research about Iran's domestic and foreign policy, and he is known as he has a PhD in Iranian history, and of course, he is a senior research fellow at European Union Institute for Security Studies in Paris.
Not any longer, not any longer. I quit.
Really? Okay, sorry. That was
10 years ago. So I was.
Yeah, so that's the second disclaimer.
Afterwards, I was at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik in Germany, advising the German government. And I'm back to Austria at the National Defense College. This is why I made the disclaimer.
Yes, yes.
So,
sorry.
But I was in the beginning, yeah.
Yes, of course. Yeah, so I was going to continue and mention that you're a member of National Defense Academy at Institute for Peace Support and Conflict Management in Vienna. Of course, that's your current position at the moment. And of course, today we have the honor of having one of our guests is from Vienna as well, Mr. Professor Heinz Gartner. He works for the International Institute for Peace in Vienna. So of course, we are looking forward to your discussion, and floor is yours, Mr. Posch. Thank you.
Thank you very much. To begin with, I would like to quote two authors from the fin de siècle because they are relevant to the state of Europe and European international affairs, and which will then lead me to the regional security nexus. The one is Stefan Zweig, The World of Yesterday, and the one is Antonio Gramsci, when he said the old is dead and the new cannot be born, or at least not be born yet. And this is very much what we see with the JCPOA negotiations, namely from the perspective of the European Union acting as an unison actor, acting in the sense of overbridging internal divisions and contradictions, such as how do you balance the legitimate concerns on the nuclear program with energy resources, the need of energy, and the human rights debate. And this started from all the beginning in 2002, when we could say where the real negotiation started. And I'm very grateful for my friend Riccardo, who pointed out and wrapped up all these arguments we are listening to and hearing for about 20 years now, the issue of what are Iran's intentions, etc., etc. And I think especially towards the end, you made it crystal clear that there's one picture, but we still have a reading which pretends as nothing has changed in 20 years, as there has never been a JCPOA signed, and what is more important, very hard negotiated about. It was not easy. It was never easy negotiations. They have a lot to do with how one imagines the international community to work, how one imagines ambitious regional powers to have a place in there, how far can nation states go, and how much does the UN deliver. And as Riccardo pointed out, it was so essential, one extreme side effect of the, or almost the essence of the JCPOA from an institutional perspective, was to have this so-called E3 format functioning on the administrative legal side, together with the EU and with the UN. The EU was also an enabler of the International Atomic Energy Agency in this unique format EU E3 plus 3, which simply meant that you had two nuclear powers on the European side and two votes in 2 seats in the UN Security Council, which is quite something in realpolitik terms, both diplomatically speaking and militarily speaking. And as the EU E3 format was a unique combination of realpolitik and real power politics, especially towards Iran, and balancing it quite successfully with the ideal type of European EU politics, such as international laws, a treaty-based world order, etc., as it has been described in the various papers of the EU security strategies. As much as we have to say this is yesterday's world. We're in, whether we grasp it or not, from a European perspective, we are not done yet with the pure fact that Britain has left the EU. Yes, there is an E3 format, but already now I hardly read the European side and the essentially important side of the European Union in these negotiations, because they broke down definitely with European aid to what has been, especially in the Anglo-Saxon media, always the P5+1. So Germany is in, yes, but it is P5 plus 1, so under basically American lead right now. That's a far cry from where we have been. That's a far cry of where we have been. And not only did Britain leave the EU, also the US left a valid treaty, which is something which complicates also the common transatlantic worldview, because one of the cornerstones of transatlantic relations is that international signed treaties are upheld. International treaties are valuable. And with the US leaving, there is intellectually and politically simply no preparedness on the European leaderships and on the European, I would also say on the intellectual class. What do you do with the US leaving a treaty they signed themselves? So now, having said this, this is one part of the problem. And whilst the JCPOA solved the technical, diplomatic, and in any regard, very complicated side of the nuclear issue, it also helped for tacit cooperations in very delicate areas such as regional security, to which I come in a second. So with the EU, with the restart of these negotiations, is as much as the Europeans wanted to have a clear restart, and as much perhaps even the Iranians want to have it as a clear restart, it is a different restart, and it just, there was this tiny, tiny scene. It's not very important, but symbolically it says already a lot. Usually the E3 would meet together with the EU before meetings on the JCPOA or anything else Iran related. Yes, very often, a whole decade, it was the E3, the chancellors, the prime ministers, and the presidents of the E3 countries of France, Britain, and Germany, who would prepare, lay the ground, and put out all the potential pathways to negotiate. And they would meet, of course, for a final meeting, for a final briefing immediately before the negotiations and before they met with the Americans and the other partners. This time in Vienna, it was for the first time, not very much big announced, a meeting between Iran, Russia, and China in the framework of the Shanghai Three, of the Shanghai Cooperation Council. Now, I don't think that was much of a big outcome and so on, but it also shows on the symbolic level already that something has changed. We don't know exactly what it is, but something definitely has changed, because under normal circumstances, we would all watch very carefully the E3's commentaries, who meets with whom and how long the meetings took place. And I just realized, being not far away from where the negotiations took place, I didn't take too much an interest of it, but thought, oh, it's interesting that Iran, China, and Russia meet in something and claim the Shanghai format for it. That's I don't want to say that the EU lost power or gravitas, but it's definitely not the same structured work than before. It might be technically the same, but politically, you simply cannot do away with the fact that Britain is not any longer part of the European Union. As much as it's necessary to cooperate, and I hope, I very much hope that there will be close E3 cooperation with the UK continuing, but it's simply not the same thing. The European Union cannot go there and say, well, we have two seats in the Security Council and two nuclear powers. That's one side of it, which makes another issue more complicated, and that is, now falling back more on transatlantic relations, that is what has been negotiated on the sides always with Iran, and these were regional security aspects. Also in thinking, of course, that this is something where we, as Riccardo pointed out, the US are our main security provider. We are allies of the US, even if you're neutrals, they may not know, or they may not be aware of it, the fact, but the transatlantic bond, the European transatlantic bond is strong, period. So here, the issue of the, here I would first start with the issue of the, of other countries becoming nuclear powers in their own realm. I think the reality is that nuclear energy attempts in Turkey and Egypt, we simply have to accept. Sooner or later, they will come. The question whether how they come, the question whether they have the money, the question whether it's feasible technically, does Egypt need nuclear power and so on. With this, proliferation risk rises. This does not mean that it rises tomorrow, but it rises, and there would be a great need of a common nuclear understanding region-wide, which I'm very pessimistic we can reach, because from an Israeli security point, even counting their missiles and their warheads amounts to a security threat for the Israelis, simply because Israel has no, in military terms, no strategic depth. In geopolitical terms, Israel has a big strategic depth, but in military terms, it doesn't have, so they have to always to be on the edge. Having said this, I'm quite surprised to see the Europeans not to address so many common problems we would have in the region, and what the Iranians are already addressing. Let alone the whole catastrophe of the Afghanistan drug trade, of the breakdown of security in other countries. Let's look at the level of Iranian involvement in the region. Here too, we could say that the image of Iran we have, which is very much nurtured from even from Iranian imperial times. You have this powerful country which has its followers everywhere. Every Shiite a Persian, every Persian a Hezbollahi. This is simply not true. The relationship, go to Iraq, go to Lebanon, Hezbollah, the relationship between Iran and its various security apparatuses and the so-called proxies in loco has changed dramatically. As much as Iran played the key role in, helped to play the important role in defeating Daesh or ISIS in Iraq, as much this was also the work of local Iraqi groups, Shiite and non-Shiite, aligned and not aligned with Iran. Even so, whilst we had a few years of constructive engagement on the European and on the NATO side, right now I see a very simplistic reading, which simply makes breaks down all security problems in Iraq from a Western perspective to the Shiite militias and in turn to Iran, as if Iran was responsible alone for the chaos in Iraq, and as if Iraq was stable in itself. Yes, I agree. The issue of so-called proxies is there, but we do not explain we are incapable of doing a zero threat assessment if we ignore factors like the role of the economy, the role of the ideology, and the role of the, how should I call it, of the national enrootedness of the groups. Yes, there is a Shia international based around Sayyida Zainab in Damascus, but about how many people are we talking, and against whom are they trained, and against whom can you move them? Basically against ISIS and Al-Qaeda type radical Salafis. This would be the same enemy we have. Iran has a problem with jihadi returnees from Syria and other places. Europe has the same problem. Is there an information exchange? I doubt it. We just pretend this is something totally separate. And this refusal of sitting in the same boat with the Iranians on a major security concern exactly goes back to the importance which is given and donated to the JCPOA, namely the simple fact that the JCPOA is still seen as the core element defining international relations. It explains international relations. This is the interpretation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, etc. However, given all threat assessments, given the fact that the inspections are in place, I mean, if you read the media in Western Europe, you often think as if the UN had already been kicked out of Iran, as if there were no inspections, etc. Whereas the opposite is true. Whether Iran potentially will go so far, I don't know, I don't guess. But if we judge Iran from what it did until now, there was only one, I would say, dramatic, provocative step, other than the fears of the Europeans, Riccardo mentioned so eloquently, which I don't need to repeat. And this was the simple demand that if Iran goes back to the JCPOA, give us guarantees that, that you lift sanctions and we can join SWIFT code. Now, a revolutionary country that wants to join SWIFT code is, I find it hard to regard this as an ideological and or military or economic threat. It's just telling us we would like to play the game by the international economic relations, which is not debated. So I don't see very much about it. I can understand, of course, it aggravates a little bit the Iranian position, because it is clear that we cannot just take the old JCPOA and then say, well, we start here and there. That's what negotiations are about. I think that diplomats already know it. The political will is an entire different story, how you're going to sell it. Which brings me to some other factor. Usually, until very recently, and especially remember the time when the JCPOA was signed, there was fierce Arab resistance. There was fierce Arab resistance for two reasons. One reason was, if Iran is nuclear capable, not nuclear armed, but nuclear capable, and is capable to negotiate a deal which then will open Iran for European investment and help modernize the banking system and so on, at this point, Arab countries have to deal with Iran on the basis of a virtual nuclear power. It simply would mean we have to be more Iran friendly in our security services, in our foreign policy and so on. And we don't want this because, contrary to the Europeans and the Americans who see in Iran this revolutionary regime, the Arabs see not a revolutionary regime, they see the continuum of Iran Zamin, of Iran Bozorg. They see much more, as Arab diplomats always mention it to me, yes, they have turbans now, but they talk like Shah and Shah. So they have another approach, which also means they understand Iran as a national and regional power. This was the first fear, but this fear has overcome. And one of the fruits, in one important country, which directly has the potential to benefit all of us, the Russians, the Chinese, us in Europe, the Americans, and Arabs and Iranians likewise, is the very surprising and very interesting approach of the new Iranian government towards the Taliban in Afghanistan. The change of the behavior of the Taliban, we expected much more horrible things. Remember 1989, when Iran almost had to invade Afghanistan. Right now, it seems that on all fronts, be it in Arab countries in the media, be it in Iran, the often very unhelpful and aggressive anti-Shiite, anti-Sunni propaganda goes down. It's basically people have enough, and it doesn't work any longer that way so easily. The Iraqis are fed up with confessional hatred. The Syrians are fed up with confessional hatred. The Afghans are basically fed up with being in a poor and country, and only confessions and tribes matter. So there's a unique chance. A chance actors on the ground, namely Iran and Iranians and Afghans, took, supported by Arab countries. And I think potentially, if there's any stabilization of the region, then it will not come in this form from the outside imposed, so to speak, because we saw the attempt of hegemonially building up stability, regional stability via hegemony over one country or the other, did not work. Iraq is not a very stable place right now. But if you have, if it's possible to get out the brutality of confessional hatred, I mean, Qawmiyat in Iran is problematic enough. I don't want to go into this. But when we get this religious part out of it and have political leaderships who don't fan the flames of hatred any longer, which they did for years on both sides of the Khalij Force of the Persian Gulf, then I see a real chance. Why? Because the peace and the security that matters is the peace and the security of the ordinary people on the ground. And here comes again, there is something new going on, and the negotiations with the JCPOA are a little bit yesterday as well, because right now what really moves Europeans, European citizens, especially in this part north of the Alps and east of the Rhine, is not so much whether Iran has or has not even a bomb or has nuclear power. It's very much the refugee crisis. And everyone knows that most of the refugees are due to misery, mismanagement of governance and so on. And one driving factor was sectarian strife. So in this sense, I think the Europeans have to recalibrate a little bit, not devaluating the JCPOA negotiations. These remain important, but equally important is everything that creates peace on the ground. And since you cannot dictate peace very easy, no power is so strong to be able to dictate peace once you have the religious genie out of the box. So you have to settle with what is really going on, and that is the de-escalation of the religious identity factor, starting with ordinary relations between Iran and Afghanistan. I do not want to idealize. I know that there's a long way to go, but we see already that the violence shifted away, even away from the religious argument more to the social one, which one can deal with good governance and so on. Will this mean that Iran has or should or would abandon its allies tomorrow? No, but with the Shiite factor becoming less important as a driver of violence within the so-called Shiite militias, I think starting with Iraq, starting with the common understanding between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that the regional peace, or at least de-escalation, which is ongoing, is almost, I would say, and from me, since I'm a trained Middle East expert, even more important than the JCPOA. And we should see the JCPOA as an important part of a much broader picture where regional security, namely defined as the security for the people on the ground, not elite security necessarily, that this should take prominence over anything else. I thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Mr. Posch. It was very insightful. To be honest, I did not expect that you were going to actually offer a solution for regional peace as well. To wrap up your discussion, to give an overview, I think you mentioned that the cooperation between European powers and the US in order to mitigate conflict and solve the non-proliferation issue with Iran, of course, was an admirable effort. But of course, you mentioned that for regional peace to be achieved and regional stability, there needs to be a kind of more separate effort towards looking at de-escalation of religious ideologies and fighting with jihadists, which is the same goal as that Iran is pursuing. And here there is the opportunity of cooperation between Europe and Iran. And you mentioned that the fact that there was fierce Arab resistance towards the nuclear deal and the differences that exist among regional states are not only confined to the nuclear issue or perhaps religious ideologies. There, it has to do with broader issues such as the identity of the states, the history that they have, and you mentioned the previous states or governance that each country has had, and the imperial background. So with that, I would like to first add one point. Do you think that, this is actually also a question, do you think that there is a great, many people are in favor of the idea that negotiations with Iran should involve regional issues as well? And so there was so much insistence on regional issues to be included in the negotiations for a revival of the JCPOA. Of course, Iran did not agree to that and believed that it should be restricted to the nuclear issue, and there should be a different framework for regional issues. Do you think that the fact that these two issues are most of the time tied together, the nuclear issue, non-proliferation issue, and the regional stability, do you think it is going to help regional stability and peace, or is it going to exacerbate the situation and create more perhaps conflict and differences, especially considering the fact that, as you mentioned, there is a huge lobby, Israeli lobby, Arab lobby against the deal being resumed, and they are even in the US Congress trying to dissuade the Biden administration to pursue the negotiations with Iran. So do you think, shouldn't there be the first step? Shouldn't it be, this is of course an opinion and actually a question I would like to know your idea about that. Shouldn't there be, the first step shouldn't be that we separate these two issues and consider that perhaps even though in the non-proliferation issue there might be differences among Iran and Europeans and the US, and that the regional issue can also be a kind of cornerstone for cooperation rather than conflict because of the common interest concerns.
Listen, the problem for me is if these negotiations were only about the nuclear issue, they would be hard, they would be controversial, they would be complicated, needing a lot of, but what I read in the media all the time is, oh, well, Iran is doing this in Iraq, Iran is doing that in Yemen, Iran is doing this in, against Israel, and so on. So it's not, and this of course clouds the negotiations somehow, because obviously this is not about the question of this is the kind of inspections we want the IAEA to do. This is the kind of sequencing when we lift sanctions. This is the kind of sanctions that are gonna remain. So where you negotiate about something really separate. This, I do not blame Iran for mixing it up with the regional issue, but I think this is what in the West is perceived. You hear Iranian nuclear program and then pro-Iranian militias in Iraq in the radio. While, so I agree, separate would be preferable. But my core concern is, do we see and limit as Europeans Iran on the nuclear issue for all the good reasons Riccardo mentioned, and then simply ignore the catastrophe in Iraq? But at the same time, we maintain, be it in NATO, be it in the EU police mission in Iraq, invested in the Iraqi security apparatus. I mean, at least we can, I don't say we have to agree, but at least talking with the Iranians about this, or getting our mind clear about what to do, and talking more with the Iraqis also could be extremely helpful. But I don't see it. So on one hand, you have the already the issues separated. On the other hand, you get them mixed up again. So recently I talked with some American think tankers who made the following point. Yes, the nuclear issue and horrible, and we gave everything to the Iranians, well, their view. And the Shiite militias are a bigger threat than Al-Qaeda than ISIS in Iraq, which I totally disagree with. Given the fact also of the legal status and so on, and you're just puzzled. What kind of policy do you really want to follow up? Is this about what it seems to me it is? We had the old regime change policy, which was always under the button where never the state and the regime has been really differentiated. They know already that it's impossible without Arab support, and the Arabs obviously say no, because the relationship has dramatically shifted towards much more constructive relations between Iran and its Arab neighbors. So what they're doing now, well, keep at least the Europeans out and keep a maximum of sanction pressures working on. So when we hear bombing Iran and so, I don't take this as very serious, but it prevents one part of the JCPOA, which is the key part where Iran is interested in, and that is lifting sanctions. And I think this is where we're going to end up. We're going to end up with permanently sanctions Iran, Cuba style, with some way, with no regime change, Cuba style, with somehow bitterness on all sides, and what could be, and this is the why the Europeans embarked on negotiating with Iran on the first one, what could be a very constructive and a very good relationship addressing real problems on the ground, both for the people affected in the region as well as for us in Europe. And I'm afraid we're gonna end up with what I've just already said. No breakthrough, no war, just more of the same, and basically a meaningless set of negotiations, if there are negotiations at all. I don't think anyone would dare to speak out that the negotiations had failed or are failing. I rather imagine something like we had with the presidencies of Ahmadinejad. You continue, you meet, it didn't work almost, and we get more of the same and more of the same, which is a pity, because actually both sides could do better, much better.
Yes, thank you. So we have a lot of questions, so I would like to discuss more. The points that you mentioned are so interesting, but unfortunately we don't have much time. So Professor Heinz Gartner has raised his hand. Can you just...
Thank you very much. Thank you for the...
Yes.
Thank you for this wonderful presentations. They're very well informed. I will make a point of substance a little bit later. Let me first mention something else. In Austria, but not only in Austria, but in the whole world, community of Iranian studies are bemoaning the death of Bert Fragner, the grand old man of Iranian studies. So it's a big loss for our field. And I just wanted to mention this. Probably Walter wants to add something else because he knew him very well as well. So let me make another point on substance. I will not speak very long, but I'm really interested in following very closely the negotiations here in Vienna. So I'm almost there every day before the Coburg, where the negotiations are taking place. And when we hear in the international press that there's an impasse and a stalemate, and there's a blame game going on between Western parties to the JCPOA and Iran. So what I observe, that's not what is happening in Vienna. So there is no breakthrough, Walter is correct, but there is no impasse. So there is, to some extent, progress. There are three proposals or three texts on the table. This is the text of spring, which has been negotiated until June by the previous Iranian delegation as well. And there are two new texts tabled by Iran, one on the nuclear issue and one on the sanctions. So the Iranian delegation did not reject the spring text, as many expected. So they are building on them, and they're building on the old JCPOA. And the Western delegations did not reject the Iranian proposals right away. So they include, they are trying to include or including the changes in the old text. So we are discussing one text now. So, and my guess is that the negotiations will resume very soon here in Vienna, probably already before Christmas or short after. And let me just end on a very optimistic note. So probably we have a JCPOA by the end of January, beginning of February. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gartner. So, Mr. Alcaro and Mr. Posch, if you would like to have any comments on Mr. Gartner's.
I do. I think we only have 10 minutes, right?
Yeah, Riccardo, please go ahead.
We have 10 minutes, but we can extend if you agree, if you have the time, to perhaps 15 more minutes. Yeah, actually 25 minutes, finish in 25.
I will try to make telegraphic comments on 4 issues. One issue that you asked Walter about, and I would also like to make a comment about that. And then Professor Gartner's comments and the questions also in the chat. So first comment, is it wise to keep the regional track separate from the nuclear track? In my opinion, yes, absolutely. The nuclear issue can only be handled via direct negotiations because there is first a legal framework of which all parties are members, the Non-Proliferation Treaty. One of the key achievements of the Europeans in the process that led eventually to the signing of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action of the JCPOA was their ability to frame the issue constantly in normative terms. The problem for the American was Iran, was the Iranian regime. For the Europeans, the problem was Iran's behavior, Iran's compliance with its obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty and especially under the Safeguard Agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency. In the end, the Americans were compelled to frame the issue in similar terms. Not entirely because they could not, because the Obama administration was not strong enough to entirely shift the center of gravity of the discus on Iran in the United States. But that was the way for Iran and the United States to be able to negotiate, to get to an agreement without prejudice to their continuing and lingering rivalry. So the point of the Europeans, the genius of the Europeans before 2015 was that of extracting the nuclear issue from the geopolitical contest, because the geopolitical contest between the US and Iran could not be solved via a single negotiation track. It has to be a multi-layered process, and perhaps it can never be solved, it can only be managed. One way to manage it by injecting a good deal of stability into the US-Iranian relationship was striking a nuclear deal, because you would inject a deal of rules-based behavior and expectations into a relationship which is entirely shaped by brute power. So does this mean, and additionally, it is very, I mean, you cannot ignore that at the end of the day, the nuclear issue was in the hands of the P5+1 and the European Union. And these are not the right actors to do regional stuff. Regional stuff has to be regional and regionally owned. So the criticisms against the JCPOA that it did not take account of Iran's regional policies were just pretexts used by people opposed to diplomacy with Iran in the first place. So there were never really serious arguments against the JCPOA. Because if anything, the JCPOA could have helped stabilize regional relations, and because the United States and Iran would have been engaged in a less confrontational way, because they would have set a precedent for selective cooperation or selective understanding. This was something that in 2015, the Gulf Arab states only grudgingly publicly supported, but in the reality, they were not in favor of that. And Israel was publicly denouncing all the time. The only difference between 2015 and 2021, which is a bit better in 21 compared to 2015, is that now the regional environment is less opposed to the idea of a nuclear deal with Iran. The Saudis, the Emiratis, and even the Israelis are more willing now to support the nuclear deal than they were in 2015. And this is a big change. Second issue, so now you may have an alignment between the regional track and the nuclear track, but the regional track cannot be done by the United States, Russia, China, the Europeans, and Iran without any involvement of the Arabs, of the Israelis. It's gonna be difficult, but still they're part of the regions, and Turkey. This is something these countries have to do, and if there is a nuclear deal, it will be easier for them to do that. Second point, Aziz asks whether the fact that the US...
Mr. Alcaro, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. So these were your comments on Walter's presentation, yes? And now you would like to, and also have... do you have my voice? Can you hear? Okay. Sorry. Okay. So if you have anything else to comment on Walter's presentation and the points made by Mr. Gartner, we would like to listen to Walter Posch, and then we would move on to the questions in the chat.
You know, Walter, one thing that you said I'm not entirely in agreement with is the fact that the process can be drawn out as it was during the Ahmadinejad years. Because the more you wait, the less value the JCPOA has because of the sunset clauses.
Unless the policy, you know, I don't see the P5+1 or E3+3, etc., as this one cohesive and debating body as it had been, where the vision was clearer. I see much more ambiguity, and frankly, this is what. And you would also evaluate it if you say, well, the Iranians should follow up the JCPOA by the letter with the inspectors and so on. But we cannot lift sanctions because if yesterday it was the nuclear sanctions, now it's the human rights sanctions, then there's the sanctions because the revolutionary guards are all on a terror list, etc., etc. That's what I fear, that there is a tendency to do exactly what you said.
Exactly, but that was the whole point of the negotiation until June. The US tried to clarify what sanctions it would consider incompatible with the JCPOA, and which sanctions would remain in place because they would not be related to the nuclear issue. Look, I don't know. I mean, if the Russians and the Chinese have made the calculations that they can live without a JCPOA, there is very little I can hope for, because I think the Russian and the Chinese are really important in the sense that, I mean, so far they are bound by the JCPOA. So if the United States is willing to go back, we will just get more pressure from the West, from the US, perhaps even some sort of military strike. And that will mean that Iran will become entirely aligned with the Russia-China axis as a weak link of the triangle. I mean, so I really hope the Iranians are also making these calculations, because on the one hand, Russia and China now give the Iranians much more strategic depth than they did in 2015, okay? But at the same time, once you make use of that strategic depth, you become reliant on. They are not independent countries. I mean, the JCPOA is a way for the Iranians to, Islamic Republic actually, to safeguard as much as possible its strategic independence, which is one of the main pillars of its foreign policy since '79.
Yes, I agree. But you know, it's so similar to what we saw already, but circumstances have changed. And I still would like to go back to ask you again about the chance. Professor Gartner mentioned, namely that signed soon. I'd hope so, but what kind of deal this will be? Will this be something where one side at least has to admit, has to go a step further, and the Americans lifting sanctions, the Biden administration must at least allow the Europeans to lift sanctions, and I think this is very difficult.
Well, I think that first, if indeed there is a reactivation of the JCPOA, this should happen around January, February. I mean, it can always happen even later on, but as said, the farther you go, the closer you go to 2026, the less value the JCPOA has.
Yes.
So it is reasonable to assume that if there is indeed political willingness in Tehran and in Tehran to really reactivate the JCPOA, and in the United States to do more, then that time frame is credible. It's plausible, not credible. It's plausible. The issue of sanctions, I think sanctions I think that the process of the United States rejoining the JCPOA and Iran getting back in compliance with the JCPOA will be simultaneous. It cannot be that simultaneous as they did at the time of the JCPOA. And third, look, the JCPOA so far has only served the United States because Iran has been limiting its nuclear advancements, whereas the United States has conceded nothing to Iran, okay? So the US has gotten more from the United States than Iran has. Iran has only given and the United States has only taken. Now the process, I mean, if the deal is reactivated, it is the United States that will encumber it, that will have to take in a loss. The loss being the fact that Iran has acquired more know-how than it was supposed to have developed until this time, had the JCPOA been never abandoned by the United States. And so the US will have to accept that compared to 2015, the Iranians have at the very least a greater know-how. And they will have to provide them with the same amount of sanctions relief.
Yeah. I'm pessimistic. What I hope for is that there will be a revival of the JCPOA according to the guidelines Professor Gartner and Riccardo have pointed out. I think this is possible. However, I'm very, very skeptical, and I think it will be either the other side not admitting the failure of talks, but devaluating the JCPOA, whether this comes due to bad diplomacy, lack of will, or outright ill will. I don't want to decide, but I think the second negative risk of a devaluated and kind of accepted a JCPOA is very high still. But I agree with both colleagues that there is a real chance. Maybe it's if we are lucky in January. I'd hope so.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Alcaro.
Yeah, so the question about whether the fact that the Iranian public is becoming more supportive of even the possibility of building a nuclear bomb impacts European and American assessments. Unfortunately, I don't think it does. And if it does so, it does it in a negative way, in the sense that the Europeans may look at that and the Americans may look at that as something the Raisi administration can seize on in order to be more rigid, in the sense that the Raisi administration would say, if you don't do what we want you to do, look, we can even go nuclear, and contrary to what we say, we have public support. So yes, some sort of sanctions relief would really be needed. And this leads me to the question about investments and energy by Amir Mohsen-Adian. That's a very good question. I think the Russians do consider that the energy, do factor in the energy issue in these negotiations. For the Russians, the perfect situation would be, the perfect outcome would be a JCPOA, which makes the possibility of an Iranian bomb, which the Russians have never actually believed that much in the first place, but even far removed in the future, there is less possibility of a military confrontation between the US, involving the US and Iran, or US and Iran's allies or proxies. But the US and Iran remain very much rivals. So oil from Iran only flows to Asia rather than to Europe, and therefore the Russians are not particularly hit by this. The investments, the Europeans, in 2015, the Europeans had a lot of ideas in terms of investing in Iran. Now, even if the JCPOA is reactivated, I would not expect a lot of investments because investors need long-term certainty and they wouldn't have that. But what you would have is a profound rebound of trade. And trade is really important for the Iranians because the Iranians could be able to go back and sell much more oil and gas than they do now. And they would also be able to buy a lot of machinery stuff they really need to make their own industry and factories work again, to update. They really need stuff like turbines or furnaces or pumps. I mean, this kind of mechanical stuff and also electronics, which is an issue of trade, not of investment. And that would come immediately. Then you would have really benefits from the reactivation of the JCPOA for all Iranians. What would Europe's behavior be if the JCPOA is revived or if the JCPOA talks fail? If it is revived, the Europeans would leave, I mean, you would have finally EU banks funding again credit line, giving again credit lines to European exporters. So you would have a rebound of trade. You would have countries such as Greece or even Italy, perhaps Spain, buy again Iranian oil. And you will also have the Europeans, I don't know how decisively, try to engage the Iranians on some of the issues Walter was mentioning during his presentation concerning regarding common concerns. From Afghanistan to the fight against Sunni extremism and Iraq. If the talk fails, the Europeans will align themselves with sanctions. No nuclear-related sanctions on Iran in place. They were lifted in 2015, 16, and they remain lifted. If the talk fails, I guess the Europeans will have the sanctions, support readoption of sanctions at the UN level, but will continue start again.
Uranium enrichment.
Oh, your German is very good, Fatemeh.
Well, I think it depends very much on who's in charge in which country. Right now with Erdogan, Israel is extremely anti-Turkish, almost. I think there is, well, we don't know the real inner decision making of Israel. That's something totally, talking about what is talked and written. Apparently, it seems that Israel has no problem and France have no problem in supporting the Emiratis and the Saudis with modern nuclear technology for peaceful purposes, of course. What kind of nuclear facilities this will be, I rather guess this will be facilities maintained by foreigners, not so much by Emiratis or Saudis. But yes, if the, one part why the JCPOA is so important is that we legalize things, that we put them on a legal frame. However, the nuclear programs are also part of the brutal power game, and international relations are not necessarily to be dealt with strictly from the perspective of fairness.
Thank you again, Walter. It's great to see you and listen to you. It's very enlightening. I would like to thank Fatemeh and Eurica. Until the next time, okay?
Yes, sure. I would like to thank you as well for your great presentation and for responding to all the questions. I wish you a great Christmas time and a great New Year in advance.
Thanks.
Thank you.
And you stay safe, okay? You all.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye. You can respond to any of the questions that you have on the chat box, because I think my questions that I have are a bit different.
Yeah. Well, to begin with, we all know that the nuclear program is actually a Pahlavi program. This is why also everybody is so distrustful, because we knew the Shah was ready to build a bomb. Khomeini gave the fatwa that this is haram. That's that we know this story. We know that the Iranian people, the nationalists, and we know the deal between the nationalists and secular nationalists and the Islamists in Iran. We know this. And yes, we are pretty much aware that the Iranian people supports the nuclear program, at least the peaceful use of nuclear energy. We're perfectly aware of that. I could see this in all parts of the country, from Kerman to Tabriz. There's no doubt about this. This is what we know. I'm not so sure. I mean, those who mostly supported the nuclear bomb were not inside Iran, but outside. These were people like Ardashir Zohedi and others, Parviz Sabeti, and all these beautiful people from the previous regime. They were vociferously in favor of a nuclear bomb, because they said this is the right of Iran, and this is what the Arabs understood, because for them one Persian is a Persian, and they don't. They said, well, that's the same thing. But I think we are beyond that. With the signing of the JCPOA, de facto is that the understanding is that Iran is a responsible power, and this is about negotiating, of clarifying the non-proliferation treaty. I do not think that Iran would ever leave the non-proliferation treaty. The non-proliferation treaty has its weaknesses, we all know, but regarding to Iran, and the JCPOA is a way to overcome this and to make this mutually acceptable. And on the rest, I think I don't have to repeat what I said. On a personal note, I would like to add, last week my professor passed away. I'm very close to his family, and it's very hard for me to talk about it. This is why I did not mention him. He was a great person and a great scholar of Iran and the surrounding area.
Yeah.
Another question was there?
No, thank you very much, because we are running late, we're running out of time, and I don't want to take more of your time, because this is actually, we extended the session. So we can keep in contact, keep in touch, and perhaps if you have time, ask the other questions via email. We were really delighted to have you at today's webinar, and we hope that we will have the chance to host you again. And I was also really sorry about the passing, that your professor has passed away. We heard the news as well in Iran, and many Iranian studies professors also were sorrowful about that.
Thank you.
So, of course, with hoping that the deal would be revived in Vienna and the talks would result in the resumption of the JCPOA. And I really wish you a great Christmas holiday and great New Year, and hope to see you perhaps in Tehran, as I think if you have studied Iran's history, you would be delighted. I mean, I hope that you would be willing to come one day after the pandemic. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for listening and participating. And Merry Christmas.
Thank you very much. Very kind of you.